Family is supposed to mean love. The mother who raised you, who fed you, who sat at the foot of your bed when you were sick, is supposed to be the last person in the world you would ever turn against. She is the one who said yes when no one else would. She is the one who paid the bills. She is the one who waited up. But for the mothers in these cases, the moment came when the daughter she had given everything to had already decided that everything was not enough. They were asleep in their own bedrooms. They were on the kitchen floor. They were coming home from work. They were sitting across from her at dinner. The conversations they thought they were having, and the conversations their daughters were already having with someone else, are what bind them together. Today we are covering 10 spoiled daughters who killed their mothers, and the moments that broke the houses open. Case 1. Carly Gregg. At 3:54 in the afternoon on Tuesday, March 19, 2024, Ashley Smiley pulled into the driveway of her home in Brandon, Mississippi. The kind of suburban Mississippi neighborhood where the houses sit on quarter-acre lots, where the front yards are kept neat in the way that working families with full schedules manage to keep them neat, where the school day ends at 3 and the late afternoon belongs to homework and dinner preparation and the long Mississippi light coming in through the kitchen windows. Ashley had spent the day teaching 9th grade math at Northwest Rankin High School, only a short drive from the family home. Her daughter, 14-year-old Carly Gregg, was in the passenger seat. Carly was a student at the same school, in the same grade Ashley taught. The two of them had been making the drive together every morning and every afternoon since the start of the school year. They had stopped to pick Carly up from her last class. The two of them had driven home. Ashley sent a text message to her husband, Heath Smiley, mentioning that she still wanted to go grocery shopping later that evening. The garage door closed behind the car. The house was quiet. 6 minutes later, Ashley would be on the floor of the master bedroom with 3 gunshot wounds to her head, and Carly would be walking back toward the kitchen with her mother's revolver hidden behind her back, sending text messages to her friends on her phone. Ashley Nicole Smiley was 40 years old. She had been born in April 1983. She had spent the entirety of her teaching career in the Rankin County school system. The colleagues who later spoke about her described a woman who took her work personally, who stayed late with students who did not understand a problem, who treated the small daily questions of a math classroom as if they were the most important questions in any of those students' lives. The students themselves, in the days and weeks after, posted photographs of her standing at the whiteboard, of her smiling at parent-teacher conferences, of her holding up signs at school events. She had 2 daughters from a previous relationship. Her older daughter, Natalie, had passed and was no longer alive, a loss Ashley had carried quietly through the years that followed. Carly had been born in April 2009. Heath Smiley was Carly's stepfather. The household ran on the rhythm of school days and family dinners and Friday night football games and the kind of small weekend errands that fill the calendar of a working family in central Mississippi. The marriage between Ashley and Heath was, by every visible measure, a stable one. Heath had been part of Carly's life for years. He had been the kind of stepfather who treated his stepdaughter as his own. That morning, Tuesday, March 19, 2024, had begun like any other. Ashley and Carly had driven to school together. By the middle of the day, Carly's teachers were noticing that something was not right. She seemed irritable. She could not focus on her work. One teacher would later describe her in a written report as having a kind of memory blank, a flat distance that did not match her usual classroom presence. None of the staff knew what was waiting at home. Earlier that day, a friend of Carly's had told Ashley, privately, that Carly had been using marijuana. Ashley had decided that when school ended, she would speak with her daughter about it. She had not made a scene. She had not pulled Carly out of class. She had simply decided that the conversation would happen at home that afternoon. The conversation that took place between mother and daughter in the minutes after they walked into the house was not captured on any recording. What is known is what came next, because the family had cameras inside the home that ran continuously. The footage, which would later be played in open court across multiple days of trial, shows Carly entering the master bedroom of Ashley and Heath. It shows her walking to the bed. It shows her lifting the mattress. It shows her retrieving a .357 Magnum revolver that Ashley had kept underneath the mattress for personal protection. It shows her concealing the weapon behind her back as she leaves the room. It shows her walking through the hallway with the gun still hidden, the camera in the dining room capturing every step she took. Ashley was in the bedroom. The cameras did not have a clear angle into the bedroom itself, but the audio captured what happened next. 3 shots were fired. 2 of them struck Ashley in the head. The third missed. The footage from the dining room and the kitchen recorded the gunfire and a scream. Ashley's injuries were not immediately fatal. She lay on the floor as her body began to fail, and during those minutes, Carly walked back to the kitchen with the revolver still concealed behind her body. She picked up Ashley's phone. She used it to send a text message to Heath that read, in Ashley's voice, asking whether he was almost home. She added a heart emoji at the end of the message, the kind Ashley had used in her texts for years. Carly then sent a separate message to a friend, a girl from Northwest Rankin High School, inviting her to come over. The friend arrived a short time later. Carly let her in through the front door. The 2 of them moved through the house. The cameras recorded Carly playing with the family dogs. They recorded her sitting at the kitchen counter. They recorded her standing in the hallway. They recorded a 14-year-old girl whose mother was passing in the next room, behaving as though it were any other Tuesday afternoon. The friend, by her own later testimony, eventually saw something in the bedroom that she could not understand, and Carly explained to her, in a calm voice, what had happened. The friend did not call the police. She left the house. She went home. Heath Smiley did not see the message immediately. He was at work. By the time he received the text and began driving home, Ashley had already passed. Carly waited. The minutes between the message and Heath's arrival home stretched for nearly an hour. During that time, Carly was on her phone. At one point, she went back into the bedroom and dragged her mother's body partly across the floor in what investigators would later describe as an attempt to move the body out of immediate view. The footage shows her doing this calmly, without urgency. She returned to the front of the house. She positioned herself near the entryway with the loaded revolver. The cameras captured her standing there. When Heath opened the front door at 5:03 in the afternoon, she fired. The shot struck him in the shoulder. Heath, wounded, understood almost immediately what was happening. He grabbed for Carly. There was a struggle in the entryway. Heath managed to get hold of the gun. Carly broke free and ran. Heath called 911. His voice on the recording is broken and disbelieving. He told the dispatcher that his stepdaughter had shot him and that he believed she had also taken the life of his wife. He repeated the words. He sounded like a man trying to make a sentence make sense out loud. Officers from the Rankin County Sheriff's Office arrived within minutes. They found Heath wounded but alive. They found Ashley in the bedroom. They found Carly inside the home, and she was taken into custody at the scene. The revolver was recovered. The friend who had been in the house earlier was interviewed. The cameras were collected. The hard drive that stored the footage was placed into evidence. Within hours, investigators understood that they had a near-complete visual record of every step of what had happened in that house that afternoon. They had Carly walking to the bedroom. They had Carly lifting the mattress. They had Carly retrieving the gun. They had the audio of the 3 shots. They had the texts. They had everything except the conversation that had taken place between mother and daughter in the minutes before the gun came out from under the mattress. Carly was charged with first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and tampering with evidence. The state moved quickly to try her as an adult, and the case was assigned to Judge Dewey Arthur in the Rankin County Circuit Court. Bubba Bramlett, the Rankin County District Attorney, took the case for the prosecution. He told reporters at an early press conference that Carly Gregg, in his words, was evil, and that the truth of the case was simply that evil sometimes came in young packages. The defense team raised a question of mental illness. They argued that a recent change in Carly's prescription medication for anxiety had triggered the events of that afternoon, and that she had not understood what she was doing. They argued she should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Carly's grandparents on her mother's side, who would later face the impossible position of being the parents of the person Carly had taken from them, and also the grandparents of Carly herself, stood by her in the early days. Heath Smiley did not. The trial took place across 5 days in September 2024. The prosecution played the camera footage in open court. The jury watched Ashley walk into the bedroom alive. They watched Carly retrieve the gun. They heard the 3 shots through the speakers in the courtroom. They watched the minutes that followed. They watched the text that had been sent in Ashley's name. They watched Carly position herself by the door for Heath. The defense called its mental health experts. The state called its own. A forensic psychiatrist for the prosecution, Dr. Catherine Newman, walked the jury through what Carly had told investigators after her arrest, including the line that became one of the most repeated quotes from the trial. Carly had said, in plain language, that she had put 3 rounds into her mother and that she had 3 more waiting for her stepfather. Newman put that statement next to the planning visible on the cameras and asked the jury whether that sounded like a person who did not understand her actions. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. On September 20th, 2024, they returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. The court moved straight into sentencing. Judge Arthur, before pronouncing the term in custody, addressed Carly directly. He noted that she had been offered a plea deal of 40 years on the murder count alone, with the other 2 charges to be dropped, and that she had refused it. He sentenced her to life in custody without the possibility of parole on the count for the events involving Ashley, a concurrent life term for the attempt on Heath, and an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. Heath Smiley spoke at the sentencing. He told the court that the woman his wife had been was not someone who could be replaced, and that what had been taken from him in those few minutes inside their home could not be quantified by any term in custody. He spoke about Ashley as a teacher. He spoke about Ashley as a wife. Ashley's parents and the family on her side stood behind him in the courtroom. Carly's grandparents on her mother's side stood as part of that group as well, even though Carly was their granddaughter. The split inside the family was visible across the courtroom benches. Carly Gregg is currently held in the Youthful Offender Unit of the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility in Rankin County. She turned 16 behind those walls. Her appeal has been filed. A group called Carly's Warriors, set up in early 2026 by her maternal grandparents, has continued to argue publicly that her sentence was disproportionate to the crime, that the medication change was the real explanation, that a 14-year-old should not be sentenced to die in a correctional facility in Mississippi. Heath Smiley has been part of that effort, in a way that has surprised some of the people who watched the trial. The Smiley home in Brandon was sold. Ashley's students at Northwest Rankin High School, the 9th graders who had been preparing for end-of-course assessments that spring, are now several years older. Some of them have spoken at memorial events about the teacher who stayed late with them when they did not understand a problem. The bedroom where Ashley lost her life has been emptied and repainted by people who never met her. What stays in the public record about Ashley Smiley is the simple, unsettling shape of what happened in her own home that Tuesday afternoon. A working mother in Brandon, Mississippi, a 9th grade math teacher who had spent the day with the same students she would have spent the next several months preparing for assessments, a daughter she had decided to speak with that afternoon about a friend's report of marijuana use, a 6-minute window between walking through the garage door and being on the floor of her own bedroom, a revolver kept under the mattress for personal protection that had been used against her instead. A jury in Rankin County that had been given something almost no jury in any American courtroom is ever given. They had watched the entire act unfold on a series of household cameras, narrated by no one. They had watched a 14-year-old girl walk through her own home with a revolver at her back. They had watched a mother who had no idea anything was wrong. They had watched the moments in between. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Carly Gregg made the decision to take her mother's life within hours of being told there would be a conversation about marijuana. The next case begins with a 14-year-old in California who reached the same decision after her mother turned over a diary to the local sheriff's office and a 19-year-old boyfriend named Stephen who was waiting outside. Case 2. Tyler Witt. The dinner that Joanne Witt and her daughter shared on the evening of June 11, 2009 was, by every account from the staff at Joni's Cafe and Grill in Shingle Springs, California, the strangest meal the servers had seen in a long time. Joanne, 47, had brought her 14-year-old daughter Tyler to the restaurant for what looked, at first, like an ordinary mother and daughter dinner on a warm Northern California evening. The waitress who seated them, Perez, would later testify that she could not stop looking at Tylar's face as she walked the two of them to their table. The girl was not crying, she was not angry, she was not anything. Perez described it as a blank stare, the kind of expression she had not seen in a lifetime of waiting tables. Over the course of the meal, Perez overheard Joanne tell her daughter that she had filed statutory rape charges against Tylar's boyfriend and turned over the diary to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. Tyler did not react. Joanne, leaning in, said, "You know, he's in real trouble." Tyler did not react to that either. The two of them finished their meal and went home to El Dorado Hills. By dawn the following morning, Joanne would no longer be alive. Joanne M. Witt was a single mother. She had been raising Tyler largely on her own and worked as an engineer for El Dorado County. The people who knew her described a woman who cooked elaborate meals for her friends, who never said an unkind word about anyone, who had built a life of quiet competence around her only child. Her parents, Norb and Judy Witt, had spent their working years preparing for a retirement that included long stretches traveling the country in a luxury recreational vehicle. They had returned to El Dorado Hills from a 2-month trip only days before everything fell apart. Norb later said, simply, that his daughter had loved her granddaughter more than anything and had built her life around her. Tyler Marie Witt was 14 years old. She was about to finish 9th grade at Oak Ridge High School. In December 2008, on a casual afternoon at a coffee shop in El Dorado Hills town centre, she had been introduced to a young man called Stephen Culver. Culver was 19. He went by the nickname Boston. Tyler would later testify that he told her he loved her within weeks of meeting her, and that she felt the same. The relationship, by Tyler's own account at trial, was the most important thing in her life, almost from the start. She told the jury that if Culver had asked her to jump off a bridge, and she had asked him why, and he had told her to trust him, she would have done it. Joanne, when she met Culver, was uncertain. He was older than her daughter, he was male. Tyler reassured her, repeatedly, that the relationship was not romantic. She told her mother that Culver was gay, and that what she shared with him was closer to a friendship between siblings. On that basis, and against the advice of her own family, Joanne agreed to let Culver move into a spare room of the house. The arrangement lasted roughly a month. During that month, by Tyler's own later admission, she and Culver began using marijuana, MDMA, and cocaine inside the house. They began having a sexual relationship. Joanne discovered the truth when she came home one afternoon and walked into Culver's room without knocking. Tyler was inside the closet, naked, holding a pillow against herself. Culver was in the room. Joanne ordered him out of the house immediately. She called a friend, Vinnie Catapano, to help her remove his belongings to the sidewalk. Catapano warned Culver, in plain language, not to make contact with the family again. For a brief stretch, Tyler's grandfather Norb believed the danger had passed. It had not. According to later testimony from Norb, Culver entered the house secretly, through windows and back doors, somewhere in the region of 20 times in the weeks that followed. Joanne, in the same period, found Tyler's diary. The contents of the diary made the nature of the relationship undeniable. Joanne, as a mother, made a decision. She drove to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office and filed a statutory rape complaint against Culver. She handed the diary over as evidence. When Tyler found out what her mother had done, she did not see it as a mother trying to protect her child. She saw it as the obstacle that needed to be removed. According to her own trial testimony, she went into a full panic attack the moment she understood that everything in the diary was now in police hands. Everything was in there, she said. There was no way Culver was going to get out of the charges. She and Culver, in the days that followed, discussed running away to San Francisco together. They discussed a Romeo and Juliet scenario in which they would take their own lives. Culver, by Tyler's account, told her that ending their lives would be a last resort. The other option was to make sure Joanne could never tell the police anything else. The dinner at Joni's Cafe took place on the evening before the killing. After Joanne told Tyler what she had filed and what she had handed over, Tyler went home and sent a message to Culver. "Come over tonight." Joanne, exhausted, went to bed early. Around the time Joanne fell asleep, Culver arrived at the house. He had with him a large chef's knife taken from his place of work. Tyler let him in through a window. She took a knife from her own kitchen. Together, the two of them walked up the stairs to Joanne's bedroom. Tyler's account of what happened next has shifted across her interviews and testimony, but the version she gave under oath at Culver's trial in 2011 is the one preserved on the court record. She said the two of them stood in the doorway. Culver stepped forward toward the bed. Tyler said she could not bring herself to follow. She put her hands over her ears. She closed her eyes. She hummed to herself so that she would not hear anything. The forensic evidence later established that Joanne was stabbed more than 20 times. Her throat was cut. The medical examiner described the injuries as among the most violent he had encountered in El Dorado County. There was male DNA under Joanne's fingernails. She had fought. Culver came out of the bedroom with blood on his clothing and a single drop of blood under one eye. Tyler said she hugged him and told him everything was going to be all right. The two of them did not call anyone. They did not run immediately. They cleaned up what they could and left in Joanne's car at some point in the early morning hours. They drove first to the home of Culver's father in El Dorado Hills, where the murder weapon was thrown down a large drain outside the property. They then headed for San Francisco. Joanne did not turn up to work on Monday. She did not turn up on Tuesday either. Her supervisor, knowing this was completely out of character, contacted her parents, Norb and Judy, on Monday, June 15th. Norb drove to the house, unlocked the door, and walked inside. He found his daughter. Police arrived within minutes. The blood was extensive. Tyler was missing. At first, the deputies thought they might be looking at a kidnapping, that the daughter had been taken by whoever had attacked the mother. That theory lasted only as long as it took investigators to interview Joanne's colleagues and run Tyler's name through the system. Tyler and Culver were located in San Bruno, California, several days after the killing and arrested. When detectives sat down with Tyler, she insisted at first that her mother could not be deceased. She refused to believe it. She demanded a lawyer and ended the interview. Culver, in his own interview, asked the detectives whether Tyler was all right. Both teenagers, separately and on tape, left a paper trail of incriminating statements over the days that followed. Tyler's brother, Michael Witt, was the family member who returned to the house and cleaned the blood from his sister Joanne's bed. He would later, at sentencing, describe what that took out of him. The case against Culver went to trial in El Dorado Superior Court in May 2011. Tyler accepted a plea agreement before trial. In exchange for testifying truthfully against Culver, her charge was reduced from first degree to second degree, and her term in custody became 15 years to life rather than 25 to life. She took the stand. She walked the jury through the dinner at Joni's, the diary, the planning, the night of the attack, the humming with her hands over her ears. Culver's defense attorney, Dane Weiner, attacked her credibility relentlessly and argued, alternately, that Tyler had been the one who carried out the attack and that Culver had only confessed to friends to protect her. The jury rejected that. They convicted Culver on June 15, 2011, exactly 2 years after Joanne had passed. He received life without the possibility of parole. He is currently held at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton. Tyler was sentenced on August 12, 2011. Judge Daniel Proud, before pronouncing the term in custody, told her, in plain language, that she had deprived her family of a mother who had dedicated her life to her. He told her that Joanne had loved her, that Joanne had tried her best, and that the person who had loved her more than anyone in the world without reservation was no longer alive. Norb Witt, in his statement to the court, accused Culver of corrupting his granddaughter, but he did not absolve Tyler. Years later, in interviews, he would say a sentence that did not make headlines, but stayed with the people who heard it. If she had not done whatever she did, his daughter would still be alive. Tyler served her time at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She became eligible for parole consideration in 2021. On August 26, 2022, the parole board granted her release, and she walked out of the facility in 2023. The diary that had triggered everything, the one Joanne had handed over to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office in the hope that it would protect her daughter, sits in a sealed evidence file. The room where Joanne fell asleep on her last night still exists in a house on a quiet El Dorado Hills street, lived in now by people who know what happened there only because the neighbours have told them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tyler Witt and Stephen Culver waited until Joanne was asleep before they walked up the stairs together. The next case happened in another country, in a market town in Lincolnshire, where a 14-year-old girl named Kim let her boyfriend Lucas in through a bathroom window after midnight, carrying a bag of kitchen knives, while her mother and her younger sister Katie slept in the rooms above. Case 3. Kim Edwards. It was just before midnight on Wednesday, April 13, 2016, in the small Lincolnshire market town of Spalding. The kind of English town where the streets settle into quiet by 9 in the evening, where the street lamps cast yellow circles on the pavement of the older terraced rows, where most front doors have been the same colour for 20 years. The houses on Dawson Avenue were ordinary, brick fronts, small front gardens, the kind of street where the loudest sound at midnight on a Wednesday was the wind moving through the early spring leaves of the trees that lined the pavement. Inside one of those small terraced houses, a 49-year-old woman named Elizabeth Edwards was asleep upstairs in her own bedroom. Her 13-year-old daughter Katie was asleep in another bedroom. Her 14-year-old daughter Kim was awake. Kim was waiting. At some point shortly after midnight, 3 soft knocks landed against the bathroom window at the back of the house. Kim got out of bed, walked to the bathroom, slid the window open, and let her boyfriend climb inside. Elizabeth Edwards had raised both her daughters mostly on her own. She was 49 years old. She had been a single mother for most of Kim's life, after Kim's father had walked out when Kim was very small. She worked. She managed the bills. She kept the small household running on the kind of careful budget that single mothers in working-class English towns have always run their homes on. The friends and neighbours who later spoke about her described a woman who kept her head down, who did not complain, who was devoted to her 2 girls in the quiet, undemonstrative way that English mothers of her generation tended to be. Katie Edwards was 13 years old. She was a Year 8 student at Spalding High School. She was quiet. She liked drawing. She was the younger of the 2 sisters, and by every account, the easier of the 2. The household, before things began to come apart, had been a household of 3 women, navigating ordinary money worries and ordinary teenage friction in an ordinary terraced house in an ordinary English town. Kim Edwards was 14. She had been struggling for some time. Her relationship with her mother had been difficult for years. There had been an incident much earlier, in 2008, when Kim was 6, in which Elizabeth had struck her during a household row. Elizabeth herself had referred the matter to social services. Both girls had been placed temporarily into care. The file had eventually been closed. Life had resumed. The relationship between Elizabeth and her older daughter had not entirely healed. Over the years that followed, the rows had continued. Kim had at one point told a support worker that her mother had tried to throttle her. A suicide note had once led Elizabeth to arrange an emergency psychiatric assessment for her daughter. Doctors had found no signs of mental illness. The home had remained tense. The boyfriend Kim let in through the bathroom window that night was a 14-year-old named Lucas Markham. The 2 of them had met in school. Lucas, by every account in the eventual court record, came from a difficult home of his own. The 2 of them had bonded quickly and intensely, in the way that 14-year-olds bond when they have decided that the other person is the only one in the world who understands them. They had been together for several months. Elizabeth had not approved of the relationship. She had told Kim that the 2 of them spent too much time together, that the influence was not a good one. The previous October, Kim and Lucas had run away together. They had been found 6 days later, sleeping in a wood north of their hometown. Elizabeth had been furious. She had banned Kim from seeing Lucas again. The ban had not held. In March 2016, Kim had taken an overdose of painkillers. She had survived. After that, she and Lucas had started talking, between themselves, about killing her family. The plan, by Kim's eventual admission to police, was that the only way for the 2 of them to be together was if her mother could no longer stop them. Kim had also decided, in her own words, that her younger sister Katie should not be left behind. Killing Katie would, Kim said, spare her the heartbreak and the emotions of losing her mother. The plan had been discussed for weeks before the night of April 13th. Lucas had walked the 30 minutes from his own house to Kim's that night. He had brought a bag with him. Inside the bag were several knives he had taken from his aunt's kitchen. He arrived at the back of the Edwards house just after midnight. He knocked 3 times on the bathroom window. The 3 knocks had been the prearranged signal. Kim had been waiting for them. She let him in. The 2 of them stood quietly in the bathroom for a few moments. Then they took the knives out of the bag. Kim's mother was asleep in the upstairs bedroom. Kim's sister was asleep across the hall. The 2 of them moved quietly. They did not speak. They walked together down the small upstairs corridor to Elizabeth's bedroom door. Lucas went in first. Elizabeth was asleep on her side. Lucas walked over to the bed. He stabbed her in the neck. Kim's later account, given to police, was that her mother had not gone easily. Elizabeth had woken. She had fought. Lucas had pushed her down with a pillow. He had held the pillow over her face. He had put his weight on her. According to Kim, even with her voice box cut, Elizabeth had managed at one point to say the words, "Get off me." Kim said it had taken about 10 minutes. Eventually, Elizabeth had stopped moving. Kim and Lucas then walked to the room where Katie was asleep. The plan had been for Kim to do it, on the basis that this was Kim's family. Kim went into the room with the knife. She stood by the bed. She had a panic attack. She could not do it. Lucas told her to wait. He went into Katie's room himself. He stabbed her, by his own later admission, although he told police he was not entirely sure whether the blade had gone into her or into the mattress. He smothered her with a pillow as well. Katie was 13 years old. She had been asleep when the door opened. Once both of them were no longer alive, Kim and Lucas went downstairs. The next several hours of what they did inside the Edwards house have become some of the most quoted details of any teenage murder case in modern British legal history. The 2 of them ran a bath together. They sat in the bath. They had sex. They came downstairs. They ate ice cream. They put on the Twilight films, all 4 of them, and watched them through the night and into the next day. At some point on the morning of April 14th, they discussed taking their own lives. They did not. They simply stayed in the house with the bodies upstairs. 2 days passed. Lucas's aunt, who knew her nephew had not been home, reported him missing. The police went looking. The Edwards house had not yet been entered. The 2 children inside were eventually located when officers, working from what Lucas's aunt had told them about Kim, arrived at the front door of the Dawson Avenue house. The officers found Lucas and Kim inside the home. Upstairs, in their bedrooms, they found Elizabeth and Katie. When Kim was asked, in her police interview, how she felt about what had been done, she told officers that she was all right with it. She told them her mother no longer had to deal with her being suicidal, and her mother no longer had to wake up every morning worrying whether Kim was still alive. She told them her sister no longer had to go through any of the heartbreak. She told them she had been excited about killing her mother, and that she had been looking forward to it. She told them she missed her sister, but that killing her had not been an act of anger. The transcripts of those interviews were later read into open court. The trial took place at Nottingham Crown Court in October 2016. Kim and Lucas, both still 14, were tried as adults under English law because of the seriousness of the charges. The court was told the full sequence of events: the bath, the Twilight films, the ice cream. Mr. Justice Haddon Cave heard the case. The 2 children entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility, but the prosecution did not accept those pleas, and the trial proceeded on the murder charges. The jury convicted both of them of murder. The judge sentenced both of them to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, with a minimum tariff of 17.5 years. He told the court that the case was, in his long judicial career, one of the most disturbing he had encountered. He said the planning had been chillingly detailed. He said the 2 children had executed their plan with cold precision. A reporting restriction had originally prevented the British press from naming Kim and Lucas. That restriction was lifted by the courts later in 2016. The names became public. The case became a national news story. Channel 5 in the United Kingdom eventually produced a full documentary about the case. Criminologists wrote about it. The case has been used in academic work on adolescent psychopathy and on the influence of intense, isolating teenage relationships on already troubled young people. Kim Edwards is currently held in a young offenders institution. Lucas Markham is held separately. Neither of them will be eligible for parole consideration before serving the minimum term. Their case is sometimes referenced in the British press as the Spalding murders, sometimes as the Twilight murders, a name that has stuck because of what they were watching downstairs while Elizabeth and Katie were upstairs. The house on Dawson Avenue has been sold. The neighbours on the street, the ones who had been there in 2016, eventually left or stopped speaking about it. The bedroom where Elizabeth was attacked and the bedroom where Katie was attacked are now part of someone else's home. Spalding has gone back to being the quiet Lincolnshire market town it has always been. Most of the people who pass Dawson Avenue do not know what happened in one of those small terraced houses on a Wednesday night in April 2016. Elizabeth Edwards was 49 years old. She had been a single mother for most of Kim's life. She had referred herself to social services in 2008 after she had hit her daughter because she had wanted help. She had spent the years since trying, by the accounts of the people who knew her, to do better by her daughters. The night her older daughter let a 14-year-old boy in through the bathroom window, Elizabeth had been asleep in the bedroom directly across the hall, the way she had been asleep every other Wednesday night for years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story across the Atlantic to the small Kansas city of Hutchinson, where a 16-year-old named Tracy Miles had been told by her mother that her car keys were being taken away. By the morning of December 6, 2002, her mother Sandy would be in her own bedroom, no longer alive, and Tracy would be on a Greyhound bus heading for the Mexican border with her boyfriend, Paul. Case 4. Tracy Miles. It was the late afternoon of Friday, December 6, 2002, in the south-central Kansas city of Hutchinson, the kind of small Midwestern city where the late autumn light comes in low across the wheat fields and the residential streets settle into early evening by 5:30. Hutchinson sat about 50 miles northwest of Wichita in the kind of working-class Kansas community that had been built around the salt mines and the grain elevators and the small manufacturing plants that had kept families employed for generations. The houses on the quieter streets were single-story ranch homes with attached garages, the kind of homes that working families had been raising children in for 40 years. The grass on the front lawns had gone brown for the season. Christmas lights were already up on a few of the houses. Inside one of those modest single-story homes, a 45-year-old woman named Sandy Miles was at home. She had finished her workday. She was alone in the house. Her 16-year-old daughter Tracy had told her that morning she was leaving for school and would be home later. By the time the December darkness settled over Hutchinson that evening, Sandy would be in her own bedroom, no longer alive. Her daughter Tracy would be on her way to El Paso, Texas, with a young man named Paul Nelson, who had been hiding in Tracy's bedroom for hours. Sandy Miles had been a working mother in Hutchinson for most of her adult life. She was 45. She had raised her daughter Tracy largely on her own. She worked steady hours. She paid the bills. She had bought Tracy a car earlier that year. The car was the kind of small, second-hand car that mothers in working-class Kansas towns buy for their teenage daughters when the daughters are old enough to have a part-time job and need to drive themselves to it. Sandy had been the kind of mother who tried to keep Tracy close to her, who tried to know what was happening in her daughter's life, who tried to set the kind of small, ordinary boundaries that mothers of 16-year-old daughters set when the world starts pulling those daughters in directions the mother does not entirely trust. The friends and co-workers who later spoke about Sandy described a woman who talked about her daughter constantly, who kept photographs of Tracy on her desk at work, who had built her entire adult life around being Tracy's mother. Tracy Miles was 16. She was a junior at Hutchinson High School. By every account from the teachers and the friends who later spoke to detectives, Tracy had been an ordinary teenager until somewhere around the autumn of 2002. She had had her share of friends. She had had her share of rows with her mother. She had been a normal girl in a normal Midwestern household. What had changed her, by every account given afterward, was the boyfriend. Paul Nelson was 19. He had drifted into Tracy's life earlier that year. He was older. He had no steady job. He had moved between living arrangements. By the autumn of 2002, the relationship between Tracy and Paul had become the centre of Tracy's life. She would, by her own admission to detectives later, talk about him constantly. She would, by her mother's account to friends, change in ways Sandy could not understand. Sandy did not approve of him. Sandy made that clear. The two of them had argued about it for months. In the weeks leading up to December 2002, Sandy had decided, the way mothers in working-class Kansas towns sometimes have to decide, that the only leverage she had left was the car. She told Tracy that the car keys were being taken away. The car was in Sandy's name, on Sandy's insurance, paid for partially by Sandy. The car was in the end Sandy's to take back. Tracy, by every account from the friends she spoke to in those weeks, lost the part of her composure she had been hanging on to. The car had been her independence. Without the car, she could not see Paul as freely. Without the car, she was, in the way 16-year-old girls in love feel things, no longer her own person. The arguments at home grew louder. The atmosphere in the house grew thinner. Sandy told one friend at work in early December that she did not know what to do with her daughter anymore. She said the boy had taken Tracy somewhere Sandy could not follow. Sometime in the days before December 6th, 2002, Tracy and Paul had begun talking between themselves about how to remove the obstacle. The obstacle was Sandy. The plan they came up with, which was eventually reconstructed in court from Tracy's own admissions and from Paul's confession, was simple. Tracy would pretend to leave for school in the morning. She would let Paul into the house through her bedroom window before she left. Paul would hide in Tracy's bedroom. He would wait. When Sandy came home from work and entered Tracy's bedroom, as Sandy sometimes did to put away laundry or to tidy up, Paul would be waiting for her with a blunt object. Tracy would come back to the house later, after Paul had finished what he had been waiting to finish, to make sure Sandy was no longer alive. On the morning of Friday, December 6th, Tracy kissed her mother goodbye and left for school. She let Paul into the house through her bedroom window before she went. Paul climbed in. He hid in Tracy's bedroom. He waited. Sandy worked her shift. She came home in the late afternoon. By every account that has come out of the case since, she had no idea anything was different about that day. She walked into her own home. She moved through the small house in the way she did every evening. At some point, she walked into Tracy's bedroom. The blunt object Paul had brought with him was waiting in his hand. He struck her. He struck her again. He struck her, by the eventual coroner's count, a number of times to the head. Sandy went down. Tracy came home shortly after. She did not call for help. She did not call her mother's friends. She did not call any neighbour. She walked through the house. She found her mother on the floor of her own bedroom. Sandy was, by Tracy's later admission, still alive when Tracy came in. The injuries from the blunt object had not been enough. According to Tracy's own statements to police, she made a decision in the next several minutes that she would later not be able to explain to anyone. She knelt over her mother. She placed her hands on her mother's neck. She strangled her until Sandy was no longer breathing. Tracy was 16 years old. The mother she had grown up with was now no longer alive on the floor of a small Hutchinson bedroom by the hands of the daughter Sandy had raised. Tracy and Paul did what teenagers in over their heads have done in cases like this for as long as cases like this have existed. They panicked. They took some of Sandy's belongings. They took whatever cash was in the house. They got into Sandy's car, the same car Sandy had been threatening to take away the keys to. They drove. The plan, as it was eventually pieced together from their own statements, was to drive to Mexico. They had no real plan beyond getting across the border. They headed south. They did not get far before the car gave them trouble. They abandoned it. They got onto a Greyhound bus heading toward El Paso, Texas. They sat in the back of the bus while Hutchinson, Kansas, slowly figured out that something was wrong inside the small house Sandy Miles had lived in. Sandy did not turn up to work the next Monday. She did not answer her phone. Friends of hers became concerned. By the middle of that week, somebody had gone to the house. The body was discovered. The Hutchinson Police Department arrived. They moved through the home. They saw what had been done in the bedroom. They saw that Tracy was missing. The car was missing. They began to put it together quickly. The pattern of a 16-year-old daughter who had not been seen since the day before her mother had last been seen. The missing car, the missing money, the absent boyfriend, was the pattern that detectives in Kansas had seen before. Tracy made a phone call from El Paso. She called a friend back home. The friend, by every account, was already worried. The friend had heard from the detectives. The friend reported the call. The El Paso Police Department was contacted. Within hours, El Paso officers had located Tracy and Paul at the place where the friend had said they would be. The two of them were arrested. They had been on the run for less than a week. When Hutchinson detectives flew down to El Paso to interview them, the two of them broke quickly. Paul confessed first. He described the entire plan. He described hiding in Tracy's bedroom for hours. He described striking Sandy with the blunt object. He told the detectives the parts only he could have known, the small, specific details that confirmed his account beyond any reasonable question. Tracy, when she sat down with the detectives, took longer to break. Her first version of the events was that Paul had done all of it without her knowledge. The detectives knew that was not true. They had Paul's statement, they had her phone records, they had her own friends' statements. Eventually, Tracy admitted what she had done in her mother's bedroom in the minutes after she had come home. She admitted to placing her hands on her mother's neck. She admitted to finishing what Paul had not been able to finish. The case went to trial in Reno County District Court. Both Tracy and Paul were tried as adults under Kansas law because of the nature of the charges. Paul was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to a term in custody that, under Kansas law at the time, made him eligible for parole consideration only after several decades. Tracy was also convicted. The judge, before pronouncing the term in custody, addressed her directly. He told her that her mother had been the person on earth who had loved her without condition, that the car keys her mother had taken away had been a small attempt to set a boundary, that the response Tracy had chosen had been a response no court could find a way to understand. Tracy was sentenced as an adult. Her term in custody, like Paul's, was long. The two of them were sent to separate Kansas correctional facilities. They have not seen each other since. The case was eventually covered by the cable television series American Monster, which dedicated an episode to Sandy and Tracy Miles. The investigators interviewed for that episode described the case as one of the cleanest and most disturbing cases of a teenage daughter taking the life of her own mother that they had handled in long careers. The detectives who had flown to El Paso, the Hutchinson Police Department officers who had walked through the small ranch house, the prosecutors who had stood in the Reno County courtroom, all said versions of the same thing. The car keys had been the trigger. The car keys were the only reason any of it had happened. A single mother in a small Kansas city had told her 16-year-old daughter that she was taking the car keys away, and the daughter had decided that the car keys were worth more than the woman who held them. Sandy Miles is buried in a Hutchinson cemetery. The car she had bought her daughter, the car whose keys had been the subject of the rows in those final weeks, was eventually returned to the family. The small ranch home was eventually sold. The community in Hutchinson, the kind of small Kansas city where everyone tends to know somebody who knew somebody, absorbed the case the way small Kansas cities absorb cases like this. Quietly, slowly, without ever fully understanding it. What stays in the public record about Sandy Miles is the simple, painful shape of what happened. A working mother in Hutchinson, Kansas. A teenage daughter she had bought a car for. A boyfriend the mother did not approve of. A decision to take the car keys away. A morning kiss on the way out the door. A boy hiding in a bedroom with a blunt object. A daughter coming home in the late afternoon. A pair of hands on a neck. A Greyhound bus heading south. A small Kansas city absorbing, in the slow way small Kansas cities do, the fact that a 16-year-old girl from one of its quieter streets had taken her own mother's life because her mother had taken her car keys away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story north and west to the small Idaho mountain town of Bellevue, where a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Johnson had been told by her parents to end her relationship with a 19-year-old man named Bruno. On the morning of September 2nd, 2003, Sarah picked up a stolen rifle, walked into her parents' bedroom at 6:30 in the morning, and used it. Case 5. Sarah Johnson. It was just before 6:30 on the morning of Tuesday, September 2nd, 2003, in the small mountain town of Bellevue, Idaho. The kind of Idaho town where the houses sit at the foot of the Sawtooth Mountains, where the air at sunrise still carries the cool of the high desert night, where the residential streets are quiet enough at that hour that the only sound is the occasional dog barking from a neighbour's backyard. Bellevue sat in Blaine County, in the long Wood River Valley that stretched north toward the ski resort town of Sun Valley. The houses on the quieter streets were modest two-story homes with wooden porches and gravel driveways, the kind of homes that working families and retirees had been settling into for decades. The Johnson home on Pinecone Lane was one of those houses. Inside it, on the upper floor, in the master bedroom, a 46-year-old man named Alan Johnson and his 52-year-old wife Diane were asleep. In another bedroom on the same floor, their 16-year-old daughter Sarah was awake. She was holding a Winchester .264 caliber hunting rifle. The rifle had been stolen from a neighbour's house. The shower was running in the master bathroom. The bedroom door was closed. The next several minutes would end the lives of two parents in their own home, and they would also end the life Sarah Johnson had known up to that point. Diane Johnson was 52 years old. She had been raising her two children in Bellevue for years. Her son Matt was older, already out of the house working in the area. Her daughter Sarah was 16 and a junior at Wood River High School. Diane was the kind of mother who, by every account from the families on Pinecone Lane, ran a tight household. She kept the house clean. She kept track of where her children were. She knew the parents of her daughter's friends. She had been described by neighbours as a strict mother, in the old-fashioned sense, a mother who set rules and meant them. Alan Johnson was 46. He had been a hunter for most of his adult life. He worked. He provided. He had been part of the small Bellevue community for years. The marriage between Alan and Diane was, by every visible measure, a stable one. The household, on every visible surface, was the kind of household that small Idaho mountain towns are built around. Sarah Johnson, by every account from the friends and teachers who later spoke to detectives, had been an ordinary Idaho teenager until somewhere around the start of her junior year. She had had friends. She had been a cheerleader. She had been, in the language her own family used, a daddy's girl. What had changed her, by every account, was the boyfriend. Bruno Santos was 19. He was a Mexican national who had been living and working in the Wood River Valley. The relationship between Sarah and Bruno had begun earlier in 2003. The relationship had become, in Sarah's mind, the most important thing in her life. Diane and Alan Johnson did not approve. They had a number of reasons. Bruno was older. Sarah was 16, which under Idaho law was an issue that would later become important. Diane and Alan had told Sarah more than once that the relationship had to end. They had threatened to call the authorities about Bruno's age and immigration status if Sarah did not end it. The threats had not worked. The arguments at home had grown louder. By late August 2003, Diane and Alan had told Sarah, in plain language, that Bruno was no longer permitted in the house, that the relationship was over, and that they were prepared to involve the authorities to make sure of it. The night before the killings, on Monday, September 1st, Diane and Alan had had another argument with Sarah about Bruno. Sarah had gone to her bedroom angry. At some point during the evening or early morning hours, Sarah went next door to a neighbour's house. The neighbour was away. Sarah had a key, or had access to the house. She entered. She took the Winchester .264 hunting rifle and ammunition from the home. She carried the rifle back to her own house. She waited for morning. Just before 6:30 on the morning of September 2nd, with her father in the shower and her mother awake in the bedroom, Sarah walked to the master bedroom carrying the rifle. She opened the door. Diane was sitting up. Sarah raised the rifle. She shot her mother in the head at close range. Diane fell back onto the bed. Alan, in the shower, heard the gunshot. He came out of the bathroom. He was naked, wet, holding a towel. Sarah was waiting. She fired the rifle a second time. The shot struck him in the chest. He fell. The shot was at close enough range that the medical examiner would later describe the wounds as instantly fatal. Sarah Johnson was 16 years old. The two parents who had told her she was no longer permitted to see her 19-year-old boyfriend were now no longer alive on the floor and the bed of their own master bedroom. What Sarah did next is the part that would later be the centre of the case the Blaine County prosecutor brought against her. She did not run. She did not call the police. She walked back to her own bedroom. She removed the bathrobe and other clothing she had been wearing. She wrapped them around the rifle. She placed the bundled clothing in a kitchen trash bag. She left the trash bag at the curb of the house, in the regular trash. She washed. She changed. She went back to her room. She waited. At some point in the next few minutes, Sarah called her older brother Matt. She told him, in a voice that was either hysterical or imitating hysteria, that something terrible had happened. She said her parents had been shot. She said she did not know what had happened. She said someone had been in the house. Matt told her to call 911. Sarah called 911. She told the dispatcher the same story. She said an intruder had come in. She said she had heard the shots from her bedroom. She said her parents were no longer alive. The Blaine County Sheriff's Office arrived within minutes. The deputies walked through the home. They saw Diane on the bed. They saw Alan on the bathroom floor. They saw Sarah in clean clothes, sitting on the front porch, sobbing. They began to ask her questions. The intruder story did not hold. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no evidence anyone other than Sarah had been in the house. The bundled clothing in the kitchen trash bag at the curb was found within hours. The rifle inside the bundle had been the rifle stolen from the neighbour's house. There was gunshot residue on the bathrobe. There was blood spatter on the bathrobe. There was Sarah's DNA on the bathrobe. The rifle had been wiped, but not well enough. Sarah was arrested within days. She was charged as an adult under Idaho law with 2 counts of first-degree murder with an enhancement for the use of a firearm. The Blaine County prosecutor, James Thomas, took the case for the state. The defense team argued, in the months leading up to trial, that Sarah was a 16-year-old girl who had been in love and who had panicked, and that the evidence was circumstantial. The prosecution argued that the planning, the rifle, the bundled clothing, the false 911 call, all pointed to a girl who had thought she could get away with it. The trial took place in Boise, Idaho, in early 2005, after a change of venue from Blaine County. The jury heard from neighbours, from Sarah's friends, from the deputies who had walked through the home, from the forensic experts who had examined the bathrobe and the rifle. Sarah did not take the stand. The defence rested without calling her. The jury deliberated. They returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The judge, Barry Wood, sentenced Sarah Johnson to 2 consecutive terms of life in custody without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 15 years for the firearm enhancement. She was 18 years old at sentencing. She had been a 16-year-old in a small Idaho mountain town at the time of the events. Sarah Johnson is currently held at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She has maintained, in the years since her conviction, that she did not do it. She has filed multiple appeals. None of them have succeeded. The appeals courts have repeatedly upheld the conviction. Her older brother Matt, who in the immediate aftermath had been on her side, eventually broke with her over the evidence and has not spoken to her in years. The neighbour whose rifle had been stolen has spoken about the case in subsequent interviews. Bruno Santos, the boyfriend, was eventually deported. He has made no public statements about the case in the years since. The Johnson home on Pinecone Lane has been sold. The bedroom where Diane and Alan lost their lives is now part of someone else's home. Bellevue has gone back to being the quiet Idaho mountain town it has always been. Most of the people who pass Pinecone Lane do not know what happened in one of those modest 2-story houses on a Tuesday morning in September 2003. What stays in the public record about Diane and Alan Johnson is the picture of 2 parents in a small Idaho mountain town who had been told by their daughter that their rules about her boyfriend were unacceptable, and who had told her, in plain language, that the boyfriend was not coming back into the house. The picture of a 46-year-old hunter in his own shower at 6:30 in the morning. The picture of a 52-year-old mother sitting up in her own bed. The picture of a 16-year-old daughter walking down the upstairs hallway with a hunting rifle she had stolen from the neighbour's house the night before. The picture of a kitchen trash bag at the curb, holding the bathrobe and the rifle, waiting for the regular Tuesday morning trash collection that would never come. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story south to the suburb of Scripps Ranch in San Diego, California, where a 14-year-old girl named Heather Daou waited in the front entryway of her family home with a claw hammer in her hand on the afternoon of May 25, 2008, for her adoptive mother Rebecca to come home from a community garage sale. Case 6. Heather Daou. It was the late afternoon of Sunday, May 25, 2008, in the suburban San Diego neighborhood of Scripps Ranch, the kind of Southern California suburb where the houses sit on quiet cul-de-sacs, where the front lawns are kept green even in the long dry months, where the late spring light comes in through the front windows and turns the entryway tiles warm in the hour before dinner. Scripps Ranch was a planned community, the kind of neighborhood that had been built for families. 2-story homes, attached garages, sidewalks that connected to small parks. The houses on the quieter streets were the kind of houses that working professionals raised children in. The community had been rebuilt in many of its blocks after the wildfires that had swept through Scripps Ranch in 2003 had taken hundreds of homes. The Daoust family had been part of that rebuilding. The home they had returned to was a modest 2-story house, the kind of family home that, by the spring of 2008, had become the centre of their daily life. Inside it, on a Sunday afternoon at the end of the Memorial Day weekend, a 14-year-old girl named Heather Daoust was waiting in the front entryway. She was holding a claw hammer. The garage door was closed. The house was empty except for her. Her adoptive mother, Rebecca Daoust, had been at a community garage sale earlier that day. Rebecca was on her way home. By the time the late afternoon light shifted into evening, Rebecca would be on the floor of her own entryway, no longer alive, with multiple blunt force wounds to her head, and Heather would be sitting on the front porch, waiting for her adoptive father to come home from work. Rebecca Daoust was 56 years old. She and her husband Stephen had been married for many years before they had become parents. The two of them had not been able to have children of their own. They had spent years on the long, expensive, emotionally difficult path that older couples in Southern California sometimes spend years on when they have decided that they want a child and the ordinary route has not been available to them. They had eventually adopted a small girl from the foster system. The girl was Heather. Heather had come to them with a history that had been documented by the social workers who had handled her case. There had been early childhood trauma. There had been mental health concerns flagged from before the adoption. The Daousts, by every account from the family members who later spoke about them, had not been deterred. They had wanted to be parents. They had been told this was the child they were going to have. They had brought her home. By every account from the friends and neighbours who later spoke about Rebecca, she had built her entire adult life around being Heather's mother. She had stayed home. She had been involved in Heather's school. She had been the kind of mother who knew the parents of her daughter's friends. She had been described by the people on her street as the woman who organised the block parties, who brought casseroles when neighbours were ill, who kept track of the small daily rhythms of her family. Stephen Daoust, her husband, had worked. He had been a quiet, steady presence in the household. The two of them had built, in the way older first-time parents sometimes build it, a careful, attentive, slightly anxious family life around the daughter they had waited so long to have. Heather Daoust was 14. She was a freshman at a private school in San Diego. She had been, by every account from her teachers, a quiet girl. She had been a good student. She had also, in the years leading up to that Sunday, been struggling. The mental health history that had been flagged before the adoption had not gone away as Heather had grown. She had been in therapy for years. She had been on medication. She had been diagnosed with mood disorders. The Daousts had spent extensive amounts of money and time on her treatment. They had moved her between specialists. They had, by Stephen Daoust's later account in court, done everything they could think of to do for a daughter whose internal weather was, by adolescence, beyond what most parents would have known how to read. The relationship between Heather and Rebecca had been difficult. The arguments at home had been ordinary at first and then less ordinary. Heather had told friends in the months before the Sunday in question that she wished her mother would just go away. The friends had not taken her seriously. 14-year-olds in difficult relationships say things. The argument that led to the Sunday afternoon in the entryway had begun earlier that weekend. The exact subject of the argument has never been made fully public, but the broad shape was the kind of argument that mothers and 14-year-old daughters have in two-story houses on quiet cul-de-sacs every weekend in every part of the country. Heather had been told to do something around the house and had refused. Rebecca had insisted. The argument had escalated. Rebecca had taken away Heather's computer privileges. Heather had gone to her room. The argument had not been resolved. By the morning of Sunday, May 25th, the air in the house had been the kind of air that does not let go. On Sunday morning, Rebecca had gone to a community garage sale in the neighbourhood. She had been gone for several hours. Heather had been alone in the house. Sometime during those hours, Heather walked out to the garage. She found a claw hammer. She brought it back inside. She positioned herself in the front entryway, near the door that connected the garage to the house. She waited. She did not, by every account that would later come out in the plea hearing, leave the entryway. She did not eat. She did not go back to her room. She stood, or sat, in the small carpeted area beside the door, with the hammer in her hand, for what was, by the eventual reconstruction, more than an hour. When Rebecca came home in the late afternoon, she pulled into the garage. She closed the garage door behind her. She got out of the car. She had a small bag of items she had picked up at the garage sale. She walked toward the entryway door. She opened it. Heather was waiting on the other side. The hammer came down. The first blow struck Rebecca on the head. She went down. Heather struck her again, and again. The medical examiner would later count the blows. They were in the double digits. Rebecca had not had time to fight back. She had not had time to call out. She had walked through the door of her own home in the late afternoon of a holiday weekend, and her own daughter had been waiting for her with the hammer she had taken from her own father's toolbox. Heather did not call for help. She walked through the house. She washed her hands. She changed her clothes. She went out to the front porch. She sat down on the step. She waited for her father to come home. Stephen Dowd came home from work in the early evening. He pulled into the driveway. He saw his daughter sitting on the front porch. He thought, in those first few seconds, that she looked unusually quiet. He got out of the car. He walked up to the house. Heather, in a flat voice, told him something had happened. She told him her mother was inside. Stephen walked into the house. He found his wife in the entryway. He called 911. The recording, which would later be played in court, captures a man whose voice has gone past disbelief into something else. He tells the dispatcher his wife is on the floor. He tells the dispatcher there is blood. He tells the dispatcher his daughter is sitting on the porch. The dispatcher asks him where his daughter is. He tells the dispatcher again, she is on the porch, she is just sitting there. He tells the dispatcher that he does not know what to do. He tells the dispatcher that he does not understand what has happened. He keeps repeating, in the recording, the same short sentence. She is on the porch, she is just sitting there. The San Diego Police Department arrived within minutes. They walked through the home. They found Rebecca in the entryway. They found the hammer. They found Heather on the porch. She was taken into custody at the scene. She did not resist. She did not say anything to the officers as they walked her to the patrol car. The neighbours, by every account from the families on the cul-de-sac who later spoke to the local press, had heard nothing. They had been in their own homes, on the late afternoon of a holiday weekend, watching the long Southern California light shift toward evening, while a 14-year-old girl on their street had been waiting for her mother in an entryway with a hammer. Heather was charged with first-degree murder. The San Diego County District Attorney's Office moved to try her as an adult under California law, given the nature of the charges. The case was eventually negotiated down. The negotiations took the better part of 2 years. Heather pleaded guilty in 2010 to second-degree murder. The plea was the result of months of negotiation between the prosecution, the defense, and the court. The defense had presented extensive evidence about Heather's mental health history, her diagnosed mood disorders, her medications, her therapy records, and the specific circumstances under which she had been adopted out of the foster system as a small child. The defense's experts argued that Heather's capacity on the afternoon in question had been compromised in ways the law had to take into account. The prosecution had presented the planning, the hammer, the waiting in the entryway, the flat voice on the porch. The plea agreement was the middle ground. Heather was sentenced as a juvenile. Under the terms of the plea agreement, she was committed to the California Division of Juvenile Justice. She would be held until the age of 25. She would not be transferred to adult correctional custody. She would receive mental health treatment throughout her time in custody. The judge, in pronouncing the sentence, addressed Heather directly. He told her that her mother had loved her. He told her that her mother and father had spent years of their adult lives waiting for her, and years more on her treatment after she had come home with them. He told her that what she had done in the entryway of her own home was something the court could find no way to fully understand. He told her that the term in custody was the term the law allowed. Stephen Daou spoke at the sentencing. He told the court that he had lost his wife and, in a different way, his daughter on the same day. He told the court that he did not understand what had happened. He told the court that he had not seen any of it coming. He told the court that the woman he had been married to for most of his adult life had been the one who had wanted, more than anyone, to be the mother of the daughter who had taken her life. He has not given an interview to the local press in the years since. The few public statements he has made have been brief. Heather was held in the California juvenile system for the term of her commitment. She was released at the age of 25, in line with the terms of the plea. The conditions of her release have not been made public. The home in Scripps Ranch was sold years before her release. Stephen Daou moved out of the area. Rebecca Daou is buried in San Diego. The case was covered, in the months after it happened, by the local San Diego press. It was covered, in the years since, by a handful of national outlets that revisited it as part of broader pieces about teenage daughters and adoptive mothers, and the question of what happens when adopted children, with documented mental health histories, reach adolescence in households that have, by every visible measure, done everything right. The Daou case became part of the broader conversation about adoption disruption. Adoption disruption is the term the social work and child welfare fields use to describe the small percentage of adoptive placements that, despite the best efforts of the parents and the agencies, eventually fail. The cases that fail violently are rarer still. The Daou case became, in the academic literature that followed, one of the cases that practitioners and researchers returned to when they were trying to understand the limits of what adoptive parents can prevent. The case raised questions in San Diego that were not fully answered at the time of the plea and have not been fully answered since. There were questions about how much of Heather's mental health history had been disclosed to Rebecca and Stephen before the adoption. There were questions about whether the supports the Daous had been given by the agencies that had placed Heather had been adequate. There were questions about whether a private school freshman in Scripps Ranch, with a documented history of mood disorders, had been receiving the level of care that her treatment file said she was receiving. The questions did not produce answers. The plea agreement closed the case for legal purposes. The wider questions stayed open in the conversations that adoption advocates and child welfare researchers in California have continued to have in the years since. What stays in the public record about Rebecca Daou is the simple, painful shape of the Sunday afternoon. A 56-year-old woman who had spent years of her life waiting to become a mother. A husband who had spent the same years waiting beside her. A small girl placed with them by the foster system. A daughter raised through years of therapy and medication and private school and family life. A community garage sale. A drive home. A garage door closing. A door from the garage to the entryway. A daughter waiting on the other side with a claw hammer. A husband coming home from work to find his daughter sitting on the front porch. A flat voice telling him something had happened. A 911 call from a man whose voice had gone past disbelief into something he could not name. A 2-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Scripps Ranch where the late spring light for one Sunday afternoon had touched the entryway tiles in the hour before everything in that family ended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In Alba, Texas, 16-year-old Erin Caffey was told by her parents to end her relationship with a young man named Charlie. What happened in the early hours of March 1st, 2008, started with her lying in her bed and listening. Case 7. Erin Caffey. It was just after 3 in the morning on Saturday, March 1st, 2008, in the small East Texas town of Alba. The kind of rural Texas town where the houses sit on long, dark country roads, where the porch lights are the only lights for miles, where the loudest sound at 3 in the morning is usually the wind moving through the pine trees. Alba sat in Wood County, in the kind of part of East Texas where the towns are small enough that everyone goes to one of the same handful of churches. The Caffey family home was a single-story wooden house set back from a quiet country road. The road ran through pine woods on both sides. The nearest neighbour was several hundred yards away. The porch light at the Caffey house was the only artificial light visible from the road for a long stretch in either direction. Inside that house, on that early Saturday morning, a 37-year-old woman named Penny Caffey was asleep in her bedroom. Her husband Terry was asleep beside her. Their 2 younger sons, 8-year-old Bubba and 13-year-old Tyler, were asleep in their own rooms. Their 16-year-old daughter Erin was awake. She was lying on her bed in her own bedroom. She had unlocked the front door earlier that night. By the time the sun came up over the East Texas pines, Penny would no longer be alive. Bubba and Tyler would no longer be alive. Terry would have been shot 5 times, stabbed, and left for dead in a burning house, and would have crawled out across the front lawn on his hands and knees, while the only person in the family who was still inside the house with no injuries was the daughter who had unlocked the front door. Penny Caffey was 37 years old. She was a stay-at-home mother. She and Terry had been married for years. They had built their lives around their 3 children and around the small evangelical church where Terry served as a part-time pastor. The family rhythm was a rhythm of school and church and home. Penny baked, Penny sang. Penny was the kind of mother who, by every account from the families on the country road, was the centre of her children's world. The Caffey home was, by every external standard, a stable home. 3 children, 2 parents, a church community, a wooden house at the end of a quiet road in Wood County. Bubba was 8 years old. He was the youngest in the family. The accounts from people who knew the Caffey children describe him as the kind of small boy who followed his older siblings around the house and copied what they did. Tyler was 13. He was in middle school. He was the middle child. Erin was 16. She was the eldest. The 2 younger boys had grown up looking up to their older sister. The 3 siblings had shared the same hallway in the same wooden house for the entire span of the boys' lives. Erin Caffey was a junior in high school. She sang in the church choir. She had been, by every account from the people who knew her, the kind of girl East Texas evangelical communities raise. Polite, soft-spoken. She had also, in the months before that Saturday morning, fallen in love with a young man named Charlie Wilkinson. Charlie was 18. He was, by every account, not the kind of young man Penny and Terry Caffey had imagined for their daughter. Penny and Terry had told Erin that the relationship had to end. They had not approved of Charlie. They had told her, in the weeks leading up to that night, that she was no longer permitted to see him. Erin had decided, in those same weeks, that the only way to be with Charlie was to remove the parents who had told her no. Erin recruited Charlie. She also recruited a friend of Charlie's, a young man named Charles Wade, who was 19. Wade brought along his girlfriend, Bobby Johnson, who was 17. The 4 of them spent the days before March 1st talking about the plan. The plan, by Erin's later admission to investigators, was to enter the Caffey house in the middle of the night and end the lives of everyone in the family. Erin would be the one who let them in. The 2 younger brothers were part of the plan. Erin had decided, in her own words, that the brothers could not be left behind to grieve. The reasoning she gave to the others was that any survivor would tie her to the planning, and that the only way the operation worked was if no one in the house was left to speak afterwards. On the night of February 29th, going into March 1st, Erin let Charlie and Charles Wade into the house. Bobby Johnson waited in the car outside. The 2 young men carried weapons. They carried a knife. They carried a rifle. They walked through the small wooden house. They entered the master bedroom first. Penny was asleep. Charlie used the rifle. Penny did not wake. Terry, beside her, was shot multiple times. He fell back. The two young men assumed he was no longer alive. He was not. He had been shot 5 times, including in the head, but he was still alive. He played dead. He kept his eyes closed. He kept his breathing shallow. The two young men did not check. Charlie and Charles Wade then walked through to the bedrooms of the 2 younger boys. Tyler was 13. He woke up. He fought. The 2 young men attacked him with the knife. He was eventually no longer alive. Bubba was 8 years old. He was attacked in his own bed. He did not survive. The 2 boys had been asleep in adjoining rooms in the house they had grown up in. They had heard, in the seconds before the attackers reached them, the sound of what was happening in the master bedroom down the hall. Tyler had been awake long enough to fight back. Bubba had been the youngest in the house and the last to be attacked. Erin remained in her bedroom throughout. She did not get out of bed. She did not interfere. She did not call out. She lay on her bed and listened. The wooden walls of the house carried sound easily. The hallway between the bedrooms was short. Every part of what happened in the master bedroom and in the boys' rooms was audible from where she was lying. She had unlocked the front door. She had let in the 2 young men. She knew what they had come to do. She listened as they did it. Once the 2 young men had finished, they came back to Erin's bedroom. The 4 of them, including Bobby waiting in the car, then set fire to the house. They wanted to destroy the evidence. They poured an accelerant, they lit it. They left in the car. The fire began to take hold of the wooden walls. Smoke filled the hallway. The flames spread from the master bedroom outward. Erin walked out with Charlie and Charles Wade. The 4 of them got into the car. The car pulled away from the country road and drove off into the dark. Terry Caffey, despite 5 gunshot wounds and stab wounds, despite the fact that the house was now burning around him, managed to crawl out of the master bedroom. He crawled across the floor of his own home. He pulled himself out the front door. He crawled across the front lawn. He kept going. He reached the house of a neighbour several hundred yards away and collapsed on the front porch. The neighbour found him. The neighbour called 911. Terry was airlifted to a hospital. He survived. He was the only adult in the family who came out of that house alive, and he had done it on his hands and knees with 5 bullets in his body. The Wood County Sheriff's Office responded. They found the burning house. The fire crews fought it back. The deputies searched the property once the flames were under control. They found Penny in the master bedroom. They found Tyler in his bedroom. They found Bubba in his bedroom. They did not find Erin. They assumed at first that Erin had been taken by whoever had attacked the family. They began to look for her. The early hours of the investigation were run on the assumption that the 16-year-old daughter was a missing person, possibly the survivor of a kidnapping, and that the family had been targeted by an unknown intruder. Within hours, however, the investigation began to turn. Terry, in his hospital bed, was conscious enough to speak. He told the deputies he had heard one of the attackers say Erin's name in a way that did not sound like the voice of a kidnapper. The phone records pulled from Erin's phone showed extensive contact between her and Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade in the days before the attack. The pattern of messages was not the pattern of a girl who had been forbidden to see her boyfriend and had stopped contacting him. The pattern was the pattern of active, ongoing planning between 4 young people in the days leading up to a coordinated event. The 4 of them, Erin, Charlie, Wade and Bobby, were located within 48 hours. The 4 of them were arrested. The case went to trial in Wood County in 2009. Erin took a plea. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit capital murder. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 25 years. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade were both sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson received 40 years. Charlie and Wade had pulled the trigger and held the knife. Erin had unlocked the front door. The Wood County prosecutor, in his statement to the press after the sentencing, said that Erin Caffey was the reason the rest of them had been in the house at all. The plan had originated with her. The grievance had been hers. The recruitment had been hers. The unlocked door had been hers. Terry Caffey, the only surviving member of the immediate family, made a decision that has stayed at the centre of the public record on the case ever since. He forgave his daughter. He has visited her in the Texas correctional facility where she is held. He has written about her. He has, in interviews, said that the alternative to forgiveness is a kind of weight he cannot carry. The wider Caffey family has not always agreed with him. Penny's parents and siblings have spoken publicly about their disagreement with Terry's decision. They lost a daughter, 2 grandsons and a sister. They have not been able to extend the same forgiveness Terry has extended. The split inside the wider family has not closed in the years since. Erin Caffey is currently held at the Hilltop Unit, a Texas Department of Criminal Justice correctional facility for women. She will be eligible for parole consideration after 40 years. She has given a small number of interviews from custody. She has expressed remorse. She has not, in any of those interviews, given an explanation that has satisfied the public record. The most consistent thread in what she has said is that she did not, at 16, fully understand what she was setting in motion. The most consistent thread in what investigators and prosecutors have said is that she did. The house in Alba was destroyed in the fire. The ground where it stood is empty. The pine trees still grow around the empty foundation. Most of the people who pass the country road do not know what's happened in the house that used to stand on that lot. The site has been left undeveloped. The Caffey family did not rebuild. Terry moved away from Alba in the years after the case. The country road is the same country road, but the house at the end of it is gone. What stays in the public record about Penny Caffey is the picture of a stay-at-home mother in a small East Texas town who had told her 16-year-old daughter to end a relationship with a boy the parents did not approve of. The picture of a 37-year-old woman asleep beside her husband at 3 a.m. The picture of 2 younger sons asleep in the rooms next to her. The picture of an older daughter awake in her own room, listening, as the only family she had ever known was attacked in the rooms around her by a group of young men she had let in through the front door. The picture of a husband crawling across a front lawn on his hands and knees with 5 bullets in his body, while the daughter, who had unlocked the door, stayed inside. The mindset is the giveaway. A teenage objection to a parental rule is the kind of thing every household with a 16-year-old in it has dealt with at some point. The parental veto on a boyfriend is the kind of friction that, in almost every case, runs its course over weeks or months and ends in some version of a compromise. Erin Caffey's response to the friction was to recruit 3 other young people, plan a coordinated attack across the entire family, unlock the front door, lie in her bed, and listen as her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and her father were attacked in the rooms around her. The gap between the original grievance and the eventual response is the gap that has kept the case in the public record for the better part of 2 decades. Terry Caffey has spent the years since the case writing and speaking about what happened. He has described the moment he realised, in his hospital bed, that his own daughter had been part of it. He has described the visits to the Hilltop Unit. He has described the choice he made to keep contact with Erin rather than cut her off. The wider family has described, in their own statements, why they have made the opposite choice. Both positions have been visible in the public record for years. Neither has been resolved. The case has produced a documentary, several books, and extensive American true crime coverage, all of which keep returning to the same central image: the 16-year-old girl on a bed in a wooden house in East Texas, listening, while the door she had unlocked stayed unlocked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story north to the small Canadian city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, where a 12-year-old girl had been forbidden by her parents to see her 23-year-old boyfriend Jeremy. What happened on the night of April 23, 2006, started with Jeremy walking into the family home with a knife. Case 8. Jasmine Richardson. It was just after midnight on Sunday, April 23, 2006, in the small southeastern Alberta city of Medicine Hat. The kind of Canadian prairie city where the houses sit on quiet residential streets, where the wind off the open prairie comes in across the rooftops at night, where the street lamps light up the long, flat sidewalks, and not much else. Medicine Hat had a population of around 50,000 at the time. It was the kind of place where, on a Saturday night going into a Sunday morning, the residential streets were almost completely silent. Inside one of the modest single-story homes on a quiet street in the south end of the city, a 48-year-old woman named Deborah Richardson was downstairs in the basement family room with her 42-year-old husband Mark. The two of them were watching television. Their 8-year-old son Jacob was asleep upstairs in his bedroom. Their 12-year-old daughter Jasmine was awake. By the time the sun came up over Medicine Hat the next morning, Deborah would no longer be alive in her own basement. Mark would no longer be alive in the upstairs hallway, and the 8-year-old Jacob would no longer be alive in his own bed. The case would become, by every account from the Alberta justice system, the youngest multiple murder case in Canadian legal history. Deborah Richardson was 48 years old. She had been raising her 2 children in Medicine Hat for years. She worked. Mark worked. The two of them had built the kind of stable, middle-class Canadian family life that small prairie cities are full of. The friends and neighbours who later spoke about Deborah described a woman who was warm, attentive, the kind of mother who knew the parents of her daughter's friends and who was deeply involved in the daily life of her 2 children. Mark Richardson was 42. He was a quiet, hard-working man who by every account doted on his daughter. Jacob was 8 years old. He was, by every account from the families who knew the Richardsons, an ordinary, happy little boy who looked up to his older sister. Jasmine Richardson was 12. She was a 6th grade student. She had been, by every account from her teachers, a bright, articulate child who had recently begun to drift from her old friends and to spend more time online. The drift had begun some months before the spring of 2006. By the early months of that year, Jasmine had begun a relationship with a young man she had met online. His name was Jeremy Steinke. He was 23 years old. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of older man Jasmine's parents would have done anything to keep their 12-year-old daughter away from. He claimed online to be a 300-year-old werewolf. He used the language of vampire fiction. He had drifted between living arrangements. He drank. Jasmine and Jeremy had begun meeting in person. The relationship had become, in the way these relationships sometimes do, the entire centre of the 12-year-old's life. When Deborah and Mark Richardson eventually discovered the nature of the relationship, they did what parents in small Canadian prairie cities do. They told Jasmine the relationship had to stop. They forbade her from seeing Jeremy. They monitored her computer. They told Jeremy himself, in plain language, to stay away from their daughter. Jasmine did not accept this. In the weeks before April 23, 2006, the messages between Jasmine and Jeremy that would later be recovered by the Medicine Hat Police Service contained extended discussions of how to remove Deborah and Mark Richardson from the picture. Jasmine, in her own messages, wrote that her parents would have to be killed for her and Jeremy to be together. She also wrote that her younger brother Jacob would have to be included, because she did not want him left behind. The messages were specific. They were planned. They were not the things 12-year-olds say when they are venting. On the night of April 22nd, going into April 23rd, Jeremy Steinke walked to the Richardson home. He had a knife. He arrived at the house. Jasmine let him in. The exact sequence of what happened next was reconstructed in court from the forensic evidence, from Jasmine's own admissions, and from Jeremy's testimony at his own trial. Mark Richardson was attacked in the upstairs hallway. He fought. He was eventually no longer alive. Deborah Richardson was attacked in the basement family room. She also fought. The medical examiner would later count multiple stab wounds on her body. She was eventually no longer alive in the basement. Jacob Richardson was attacked in his upstairs bedroom. He was 8 years old. According to the eventual evidence, Jasmine herself was the one who attacked her younger brother. She had told Jeremy, before the attack, that Jacob was hers to take care of. Once all 3 of them were no longer alive, Jasmine and Jeremy left the house. They drove away in Mark's vehicle. They had a vague plan of running. They did not get far. The Medicine Hat Police Service was contacted by family members within hours after relatives became unable to reach Deborah and Mark. The bodies were found. Jasmine was missing. The investigation moved fast. Within a day, Jeremy and Jasmine had been located. They were taken into custody. The case became, almost immediately, a national news story in Canada. The detail that broke first was the age of the daughter, 12. The detail that broke second was the age of the boyfriend, 23. The detail that broke third was that the 12-year-old daughter had been a willing participant in the planning. The Canadian press, the Canadian justice system, and the residents of Medicine Hat were all forced to absorb, in a matter of days, a fact pattern that did not fit any of the categories they had been working with up to that point. Under Canadian law, the youngest age at which a child can be charged with a criminal offence is 12. Jasmine was, at the time of the attack, the youngest age the Canadian justice system permitted itself to charge. She was tried under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The maximum sentence available to the court for a youth offender of her age, even on 3 counts of first-degree murder, was 10 years. The court imposed the maximum. The sentence was structured as 4 years in custody, plus 4.5 years under conditional supervision, plus a remainder. She was, in plain terms, the youngest person ever convicted of multiple homicide in Canadian legal history. Jeremy Steinke was tried separately as an adult. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in custody with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He has since changed his legal name. He remains in a Canadian federal correctional facility. The trial coverage in Canada, the documentaries that followed, the academic papers that have been written about the case in the years since, have all returned to a single question. What had happened inside that household that had brought a 12-year-old girl to the point of helping a 23-year-old man take the lives of her own mother, father, and younger brother? The answer the Canadian justice system reached, in part through court-ordered psychological evaluation, was that Jasmine had presented features of conduct disorder, that the relationship with Jeremy had served as an escalator rather than a cause, and that the household itself had given her no reason to do what she had done. Deborah and Mark Richardson had not abused their daughter. They had not been negligent. They had been the kind of parents the people who knew them described as devoted. The conclusion the court reached, the conclusion the Canadian press eventually settled on, was that Jasmine had decided what she wanted, and her parents had told her she could not have it. Jasmine Richardson served her time. She was released, under the terms of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, in 2016. She was 22 years old. Under Canadian law, her identity remained protected after her release, although her name had been a matter of public record since the time of the trial because of an earlier court ruling. She enrolled at a Canadian university. She has reportedly built a life in the years since. The conditions of her release have included ongoing supervision and mental health monitoring. She has not given public interviews. The Richardson home in Medicine Hat was sold. The basement where Deborah was attacked, the upstairs hallway where Mark was attacked, the bedroom where Jacob was attacked, are now part of someone else's home. Medicine Hat has gone back to being the quiet southeastern Alberta city it has always been. What stays in the public record about Deborah Richardson is the picture of a 48-year-old mother on a quiet residential street in Medicine Hat, who had discovered, in the weeks before her death, that her 12-year-old daughter had been talking to a 23-year-old man online. The picture of a mother and a father who had decided, the way parents in small Canadian prairie cities decide things, that the relationship had to end. The picture of an 8-year-old boy asleep in his upstairs bedroom, while the 2 adults who had given him life were attacked in the rooms around him. The picture of a 12-year-old daughter who had let the 23-year-old in through the front door, and who, by the early hours of a Sunday morning, had become the youngest person in Canadian legal history to be convicted of multiple homicide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story across the Atlantic to the small village of Great Baddow in Essex, England, where a 35-year-old woman named Virginia McCulloch had been living for 4 years with the bodies of her own parents in the upstairs bedrooms of the family home. The neighbours had not known. The post had still been arriving. Case 9. Virginia McCulloch. It was the late afternoon of Tuesday, September 12, 2023, in the small Essex village of Great Baddow, just outside the city of Chelmsford in the southeast of England. The kind of English village where the houses sit along quiet residential roads, where the front gardens are kept neat in the way that older English families have kept them neat for decades, where the late afternoon light comes in through the front bay windows of the post-war semi-detached houses and touches the lace curtains. Great Baddow had been a village for centuries. It had been absorbed slowly into the wider Chelmsford suburbs over the years, but the older streets had kept their village feel. Pump Hill was one of those older streets. The McCulloch family home was a quiet, semi-detached property on it. Inside that house, on that Tuesday afternoon, the police had finally arrived. They had been called by the family doctor. The doctor had not seen the parents in years. The mortgage company had begun to ask questions. The 35-year-old daughter who lived in the house had been answering, in increasingly thin explanations, for both of her parents for what was, by then, more than 4 years. The two parents, John McCulloch, 72, and Lois McCulloch, 71, had not been seen by anyone outside the household since the early summer of 2019. The 35-year-old daughter, Virginia McCulloch, had been the only person inside the house through every one of those 4 years. The post had still been arriving. The pension payments had still been collected. Virginia had been signing her parents' names on documents, replying to emails, fielding phone calls in the voices of two people who, by then, were no longer alive, in the upstairs bedrooms of the very same house she was answering the phone in. The deception had run for 51 months. The 52nd month was the month it ended. Lois McCulloch was 71 years old. She had been a retired secondary school art teacher. She and her husband John had been married for decades. They had raised their 3 daughters in the Great Baddow house. Virginia was the youngest. The 2 older daughters had moved out years before. The household, by the late 2000s, had become a household of 3, John, Lois, and Virginia. John, by every account from the people who had known the family before 2019, had begun to suffer from health issues. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition. He had been on regular medication. Lois, similarly, had been on medication. The 2 older daughters have described their parents in interviews given after the case became public as ordinary, devoted, quietly proud of their 3 children. The Great Baddow house before 2019 had been a settled retirement household. By 2019, it was no longer that. Virginia McCulloch was the youngest daughter. She was, in her early 30s, still living in the family home. She had had a number of jobs over the years. She had taken on a number of debts. By 2019, the financial situation in the household had become, in her own later admissions, unmanageable from her side of the books. Virginia had been borrowing money. She had been borrowing it from her own parents. She had been borrowing it without their full knowledge, in some cases by using their accounts and their identities to take out credit in their names. The bills had been mounting. The conversations she had been having with her parents about the money had been growing harder. The reckoning, by the early summer of 2019, was no longer something she could put off. Sometime in June 2019, Virginia made a decision. She crushed multiple medications, including her father's prescription heart medication, into a drink. She gave the drink to her father. He drank it. He fell asleep. He did not wake up. The post-mortem examination 4 years later would establish that the cause of his death had been a combination of substances administered in a quantity consistent with deliberate poisoning. Once her father was no longer alive in his own bed, Virginia turned her attention to her mother. What Virginia did to her mother is the part of the case that has stayed at the centre of every news report and every documentary about it. She did not poison her mother. She struck her mother with a hammer. The medical examiner would later count the blows. They were repeated. Lois McCulloch fought. The forensic evidence later established that the attack had been carried out in the upstairs bedroom. The pathology described defensive injuries. Lois had been awake. She had seen what was happening. Once Lois was no longer alive, Virginia did not call for help. She did not call her older sisters. She did not call the doctor. She did not call the police. She closed the bedroom door instead. Virginia placed her mother in one of the upstairs bedrooms. She placed her father in another. She built, over the days that followed, a kind of barrier around each of the bedrooms. She moved them into positions intended to slow decomposition. She closed the doors. She turned up the heating in the rest of the house and turned it down in the bedrooms in question. She acted, by every later account from the prosecutors who handled the case, with a kind of calculated, methodical attention to the practical problem in front of her. The problem was no longer how to stop the conversations about money. The problem was now how to keep the rest of the world from realizing the conversations had stopped permanently. For the next 4 years and 3 months, Virginia McCulloch lived in the Great Baddow house with her parents in the upstairs bedrooms. She did not let anyone in. She did not let her older sisters visit. She fielded phone calls. She answered emails. She used her parents' bank cards. She collected their pensions. She continued to the outside world to be the youngest daughter who lived at home and looked after the 2 aging parents who had decided, more or less, that they did not want visitors. The illusion was full-time work. Every utility bill, every bank statement, every NHS letter, every Christmas card from a distant relative had to be managed in 2 voices that no longer existed. Virginia ran all of it from inside the same house where the bedrooms upstairs had been sealed. The deception was, by the eventual account of Essex police, extraordinarily sustained. Virginia replied to messages from her father's GP in his name. She told the GP that her father did not wish to attend appointments. She told the GP, in her father's voice, that he was managing his own medication. She did similar things in her mother's name. She fielded the suspicions of the older sisters, who had begun asking why they could never get either parent on the phone, by saying that both parents had become reclusive and did not want to be disturbed. The older sisters were, by their own later admission, increasingly worried, but they had not yet reached the point of going around their younger sister and forcing the issue. Virginia had built, in effect, a perimeter around the house. The perimeter held for more than 4 years. The unravelling began with the doctor. By mid-2023, the family GP had grown sufficiently concerned about the lack of contact with John McCulloch that the practice had begun to take steps. There were also mortgage and financial issues that had begun to surface. Documents had been requested that Virginia could no longer credibly produce in her parents' names. Letters had been sent that needed responses she could not generate. The 2 systems that had been most consistently asking for a real answer, the medical practice and the financial institutions, had begun to converge on the same household at the same time. The doctor, eventually, contacted Essex Police and asked for a welfare check. On Tuesday, September 12, 2023, 2 officers from Essex Police arrived at the Pump Hill house. Virginia answered the door. The officers asked to come in. She let them in. The officers asked about her parents. Virginia, after a few moments, told them her parents were upstairs. She told them her parents had been upstairs for some time. She told them her father had been no longer alive since 2019. The officers went upstairs. They found what Virginia had told them they would find. The Essex Police investigation began that afternoon. Virginia was arrested. She did not resist. She did not, by every account from the officers who handled the arrest, seem entirely surprised that the moment had come. The perimeter had held for 51 months. It collapsed, in the end, inside about 10 minutes. The case went to trial at Chelmsford Crown Court in October 2024. Virginia McCulloch pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. Mr. Justice Johnson, in pronouncing sentence, told her that the case was one of the most calculated and sustained domestic homicides he had encountered in his judicial career. He noted that she had not only ended her parents' lives, but had then maintained, for more than 4 years, a deception that involved impersonating both of them in order to continue collecting their money. He sentenced her to a life term, with a minimum tariff of 36 years before parole consideration. She was 36 years old at sentencing. She would, under the minimum tariff, be in her 70s before she was eligible to apply for release. Virginia's 2 older sisters released a statement after the sentencing. They said the family had been broken in a way that could not be repaired. They said they had loved their parents. They said they had not known. They said they could not bring themselves to visit their younger sister in the correctional facility, where she would now spend the next several decades. The statement, brief as it was, has stood as the family's only public response. The 2 older sisters have not given interviews. They have not appeared in the documentaries. They have not, in any visible way, returned to the public record on the case. The Pump Hill house was eventually cleared. The upstairs bedrooms where John and Lois McCulloch had been kept for more than 4 years were emptied and cleaned. The house was sold. The post that had continued to arrive at the address year after year, addressed to a man and a woman who had not been alive to receive it for most of a decade, eventually stopped. The neighbours along Pump Hill, several of whom gave interviews after the case became public, said they had not noticed anything unusual during the years in question. They had seen Virginia coming and going. They had not seen the parents, but the parents had been described as reclusive, and reclusive was a category that, in a quiet Essex village, did not in itself raise alarms. The mindset is the giveaway. A debt problem in a family of 3 is the kind of thing that, in almost every household in the country, ends in difficult conversations and some version of a financial reset. Virginia McCulloch's response to the friction was to remove the 2 people who had been asking the questions, place them in the bedrooms upstairs, and then spend more than 4 years pretending they were still there. The gap between the original problem and the eventual response is the gap that has kept the case at the centre of British true crime coverage since the moment it broke. The gap is also the part of the case that no one inside the family, including Virginia, has been able to close in any of the public statements that have followed. What stays in the public record about Lois McCulloch is the picture of a retired English schoolteacher in a quiet Essex village who had spent her career teaching art to teenagers. The picture of a wife who had been married for decades to a man she had raised 3 daughters with. The picture of a mother who had not been able to call her older daughters in the last 4 years of their lives because the youngest daughter had been answering the phone for her. The picture of a small upstairs bedroom in a post-war semi-detached house on Pump Hill, sealed, kept cold, kept closed, kept secret for 51 months by the youngest daughter who had once been the centre of her quiet, undemonstrative attention. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case takes the story to a small wooded property near Peel, Wisconsin, where a 17-year-old girl named Ashley Martinson had been forbidden by her stepfather to see her boyfriend. What happened on the night of March 7, 2015, started in the master bedroom of the family cabin, with her mother asleep and a knife in Ashley's hand. Case 10. Ashley Martinson. It was just before midnight on Saturday, March 7, 2015, in the small, unincorporated community of Peel in Oneida County, Wisconsin, the kind of remote northern Wisconsin place where the houses sit far apart on long wooded properties, where the gravel driveways disappear into the trees, where the loudest sound at night in early March is the wind moving through the pines and the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of late winter snow. Peel was less a town than a scattering of homes in a thickly forested area more than 200 miles north of Madison, the kind of part of Wisconsin where the nearest neighbour might be a quarter mile down a dirt road. The Mathwig home was set back from the road, a modest single-storey wooden cabin surrounded on every side by trees. Inside it, on that Saturday night, a 40-year-old woman named Jennifer Ayres Mathwig was at home. Her 37-year-old husband Thomas Ayres was at home. 2 of the family's younger children were asleep in their bedrooms. The 2 older daughters, 17-year-old Ashley Martinson and her younger sister, were in their own room. By the time the sun came up over the Wisconsin pines on Sunday morning, Jennifer would no longer be alive in the master bedroom of the cabin, Thomas would no longer be alive in the basement, and Ashley would be on her way south through Wisconsin in a stolen car with her boyfriend, with the 2 younger children locked in a bedroom of the cabin behind her. Jennifer Ayres Mathwig was 40 years old. She had been raising her 4 daughters in northern Wisconsin for years. The 2 younger daughters were small. Ashley, the eldest, was 17. Jennifer had married Thomas Ayres some years before. The marriage was, by every account from the family members and friends who later spoke about it, a difficult one. Thomas was, by every account, a strict stepfather. He had set rules for the household that the older daughters had found suffocating. He had restricted their internet use. He had restricted their movements. He had told them, in plain language, who they were and were not permitted to see. The household had become, By the early months of 2015, the kind of household where the front door had begun to feel less like a door and more like a wall. Ashley Martinson was 17. She was a senior in high school. She had been, by every account from the friends and teachers who later spoke about her, a quiet, intelligent young woman who had been struggling for years with depression. She had been writing online. She had been keeping a blog under a pen name in which she had written, in extended detail, about the darkness she had been carrying since she had been a small child. The writing was the writing of a teenager who had come, in her own mind, to identify herself with a kind of horror film mythology. She had called herself, in her writing, Vampire Girl. She had written about death. She had also, in the months before March 2015, fallen in love with a young man named Ryan Sisko. Ryan was 18. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, an ordinary young man from the same part of northern Wisconsin. He had not been a bad influence. He had simply been the boyfriend the stepfather had decided, in the early months of 2015, was no longer permitted to see Ashley. The argument that led to the Saturday night had begun earlier in the week. Thomas had discovered that Ashley had been continuing to communicate with Ryan despite his ban. He had taken her phone. He had restricted her further. He had, by Ashley's own later account to investigators, made the household feel, in those final days, like a place she could not breathe in. Jennifer, by every account from the family, had not always agreed with her husband's rules, but she had not stood between him and her older daughters either. The dynamic of the household had been a dynamic in which the stepfather set the rules and the mother enforced them. On the morning of Saturday, March 7th, 2015, the argument escalated. Thomas had told Ashley, in plain language, that she was no longer permitted to see Ryan. Jennifer had backed him up. The argument had stretched through the day. By the evening, Ashley had retreated to her room. Ryan had been in contact with her, by some means the household had not been able to fully cut off. The two of them, by Ashley's own later admission, had begun to discuss running away together. The argument with Thomas, the argument with her mother, the long history of restrictions in the household had, in Ashley's mind, reached a point where there was no other way out. What happened in the early hours of Sunday, March 8th, was reconstructed in court from Ashley's own admissions, from the forensic evidence, and from the eventual statements of Ryan Sisko. Sometime in the hours after midnight, Thomas Ayres went down to the basement of the cabin. The exact reason has never been fully established. Ashley followed him. She had a firearm. She shot him. He fell. The medical examiner would later establish that the wound had been fatal. Thomas Ayres, the stepfather who had set the rules in the cabin, was no longer alive on the basement floor. Ashley then went upstairs. Her mother Jennifer was in the master bedroom. The exact sequence of what happened in that bedroom in the next several minutes was the part of the case that the prosecution dwelled on at trial. Ashley had brought a knife. She entered the bedroom. The medical examiner would later count the wounds on Jennifer's body. There were more than 30. Jennifer had fought. The forensic evidence established that Jennifer had been awake and aware in the moments before the attack, and that the attack had been, in the prosecution's word, sustained. Ashley did not stop until her mother was no longer alive on the bedroom floor. The two younger daughters, the small ones, had been asleep elsewhere in the cabin. Ashley did not harm them. She did, however, make a choice that would later become one of the more discussed details of the case. She gathered the two younger children into one of the bedrooms. She locked them inside. She left them with no immediate way out. She took her younger sister out of the house with her. She and her sister, and Ryan, who had arrived at the cabin by then, left the property in one of the family vehicles. They headed south. The two younger children, locked in the bedroom of the cabin, were eventually able to make a phone call. The call reached relatives. The relatives contacted the Oneida County Sheriff's Office. The deputies arrived at the cabin in the morning. They found Thomas in the basement. They found Jennifer in the master bedroom. They found the two younger children locked in the bedroom, alive but frightened. The cabin was placed under investigation. A statewide alert was issued for Ashley, her younger sister, and Ryan. Ashley, Ryan, and the younger sister were apprehended in Indiana within 24 hours. They had not made it far. The arrest was without incident. The younger sister, who had not participated in the events at the cabin, was returned to family. Ashley was returned to Wisconsin. Ryan was charged separately. He was eventually charged with being a party to the homicides on the basis of his communications with Ashley in the hours before, although the question of how much he had known in advance was contested throughout the trial. The case went to court in Oneida County. Ashley Martinson, who was 17 at the time of the events, was charged as an adult under Wisconsin law with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. The defense raised at length the question of her mental health history. The defense presented evidence about the long-standing depression, the writing under the Vampire Girl name, the household dynamics in the cabin, the restrictions Thomas had placed on her movements and her communications, and the broader context of a teenager who had reached, by their account, a breaking point. The defense presented expert testimony from psychologists who had reviewed Ashley's history. The prosecution presented the planning, the firearm, the knife, the locked bedroom, the stolen vehicle, the flight to Indiana. The prosecution presented the simple, painful arithmetic of more than 30 wounds on the body of Ashley's mother. In November 2015, Ashley Martinson entered a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree intentional homicide. The plea reduced the potential sentence considerably from what first-degree convictions would have carried under Wisconsin law. The judge, Patrick O'Melia, in pronouncing the term in custody, addressed Ashley directly. He told her that the household she had been in had been, by the evidence presented, a difficult one. He told her that the difficulty did not justify what she had done in the basement and in the master bedroom that night. He told her that the mother she had ended the life of, whatever the household had been like, had been the person who had given her life. He sentenced her to 40 years in custody, with the possibility of supervised release after 23 years. She would be eligible for consideration for release in her early 40s. Ryan Sisko was prosecuted separately. His case was eventually resolved through a plea to a lesser charge of being a party to one of the homicides. He received a substantial term in custody, but a shorter one than Ashley's. He has remained in the Wisconsin correctional system. The case became, in the years after the sentencing, a case that returned repeatedly in academic and journalistic writing about adolescent depression, about restrictive stepfathers, about the question of how to weigh a teenager's mental health history against the planning and the execution of a multiple homicide. The Vampire Girl detail, the writing under the pen name, the imagery in Ashley's online journals, became material that was picked over by writers and television producers for years. Ashley herself, from custody, gave a small number of interviews. She expressed remorse. She also, in some of those interviews, spoke about the household she had been in. She spoke about the restrictions. She spoke about the moment in which, in her account, she had come to feel that there was no way out except the way she had taken. The wider Ayers and Mathwig families, in interviews of their own, pushed back. Jennifer's family in particular spoke about Jennifer as a mother who had loved her 4 daughters, who had been doing her best in a complicated marriage, who had not deserved the more than 30 wounds her oldest daughter had inflicted on her in her own bedroom. The cabin in Peel was sold. The basement where Thomas Ayers had lost his life, and the master bedroom where Jennifer had lost hers, are now part of someone else's home. The 2 younger children, the small ones who had been locked in the bedroom that night, were eventually placed with extended family. The trees around the cabin still grow the way they did in 2015. Most of the people who pass the gravel driveway off the back roads of Oneida County do not know what happened in the cabin at the end of it on a Saturday night in March of that year. Ashley Martinson is currently held at the Taycheedah Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. She will be eligible for supervised release consideration after the minimum term has been served. She has continued from custody to write. The work she has produced in custody has, by her own account, been work in which she has tried to take responsibility for the night in March 2015 that ended the lives of her mother and her stepfather. Whether that work has reached her 2 younger sisters, the small ones who had been locked in the bedroom, has not been made public. The 2 younger girls are, by 2026, no longer small children. They have been raised by relatives. They have had to grow into the lives that were waiting for them on the other side of that night. What stays in the public record about Jennifer Ayers Mathwig is the picture of a 40-year-old mother of 4 daughters in a wooded northern Wisconsin cabin, asleep in her own master bedroom on a Saturday night in early March. The picture of a mother who had been trying, by every account from the people who knew her, to hold a complicated household together. The picture of an older daughter who had been writing online under the name Vampire Girl, who had been told that the boyfriend was no longer permitted, who had been carrying a depression the household had not been able to reach. The picture of a basement and a bedroom and a knife and a firearm. The picture of two small children locked in a bedroom of their own home, waiting for someone to find them. The 10 daughters in this collection lived in different countries, in different decades, in different kinds of houses. Some of them were 14. Some of them were 12. Some of them were 35. Some of them had been told they could not see a boyfriend. Some of them had been told a diary had been handed to the police. Some of them had been told the car keys were going away. Some of them had been told nothing at all that any reasonable person would have considered grounds for what came next. What the 10 of them shared was something simpler than the differences between their cases would suggest. Each of them had been told no. Each of them had been asked, by the woman who had given her life, to wait, or to stop, or to give something back. Each of them had decided that the woman saying it was the obstacle. The mothers in these cases were not strangers to their daughters. They were the women who had carried them, fed them, paid their bills, washed their sheets, refused to walk away from them even as the warning signs grew loud. What every one of these mothers carried, in the end, was the cost of having loved a child who had decided that being loved was less important than getting what she wanted. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.